Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us here at the National D-Day Memorial for our Lunchbox Lecture Series. We are so delighted for you to join us. We do this every few weeks, every 2 weeks actually, and we've got some wonderful programs coming up. And today we are especially grateful to have with us Tracy Bradford joining us. And hi, Tracy.
Hi, how are you doing?
We're doing fantastic. We're so happy for you to join us. And Tracy, I'm going to introduce you more in just a moment. Very quickly, I do want to mention, though, if you enjoy these lectures, which I know you'll get a lot of wonderful information today, and each of these lectures really are so informative. So please check out our website, dday.org, or our Facebook page. You can find all of our previous lectures located there. So if you've missed one, please go back and check them out because they are, again, very informative. And it's really wonderful to be able to do these virtual lectures, Tracy, because we get to involve partners like you in the process where it may be difficult in normal times to travel and to do this kind of lecture. So again, thank you so much for joining us.
It is my pleasure. And let me just say to everybody, happy Women's History Month.
Yes, which is why we're, again, so happy to have you here today and to tell us some fascinating stories and I think some news stories that I think everybody will enjoy listening to. And so before I introduce Tracy, let me just mention very quickly that we do have a couple of more programs coming up. So join us for Tuesday's virtual book club. If you like to read, and if you have not read this book yet, highly recommended, All the Light We Cannot See by Anthony Doerr. Have you read that, Tracy?
I have. It's wonderful. Yeah.
So John Long, the Director of Education, and myself will be discussing this book. So if you have read it, please join in. That is next Tuesday. And we hope you can join us for that discussion all about it. If you haven't read it, please join in as well, or at least maybe check the book out because I think you'll really enjoy it. And our next Lunchbox lecture is Thursday, March 18th at noon. We're going to be talking about flight nurses. Again, it's Women's History Month, so our flight nurses of World War II were extraordinary and real pioneers at the time of what they were doing in the with medical evacuation. So we really want you to tune into that if you're able. And then April 1st, we have a great program on tap called A Brit's View of Patton. So if you are fascinated by General Patton, I think you're going to really look forward to that lecture as well. But today we're just, again, delighted to have Tracy with us. And Tracy has worked in the Army Museum Enterprise for more than a decade. She's returning to the Army Women's Museum after 3 years as the museum educator in Programs and Education Department at the National Museum of the United States Army, which I must say is absolutely phenomenal. So please go. And at the National Museum, Tracy led a national recognized interdisciplinary team that recruited and trained more than 200 volunteers for their docent corps. Tracy was the Director of Education at the United States Army Women's Museum prior to her work at the National Museum of the United States Army. She's an educator for 25 years. Tracy has taught in secondary education, private industry, and the federal government. She earned a Bachelor of Arts from the College of William and Mary and a Master's from George Washington University. And she served as the educational consultant for the PBS documentary Unsung Heroes, the story of America's female patriots. Tracy's presented at the Smithsonian Institution, the Virginia Association of Museums, the American Association for State and Local History, and the Society for Military History. And Tracy, again, so delighted to have you with us today. We do encourage you. Tracy's going to go through a wonderful program, and we want you to ask lots of questions. So we're going to have a chat feature that will come up. Use that chat feature to ask any questions at the end of the program. We'll have a nice Q&A at the end. So we look forward to that. And Tracy, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. It really is an honor to be here. So I will say StreamYard is new to me, so I'm going to share my screen. So just give me a minute to walk through these instructions so I can share with you my presentation. Let me see, I'm going to share my screen. I'm going to share it with audio so you can hear my videos. Okay, so did that work? Can you all see the screen?
We can see it, Tracy. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, success number one completed. Awesome. Well, so hello, everyone. It is really an honor to be here. was such a gracious welcome. Thank you so much. So hello from the Army Women's Museum. I'm the curator here, and we are located on Fort Lee, Virginia, just south of Richmond, right off of Interstate 95. We're a great location if you're traveling north or south. The Army Women's Museum is part of the Army Museum Enterprise, and we're here at Fort Lee, which is the home to the Combined Armed Support Command, under which falls Transportation, Ordnance, and Quartermaster Schools. So currently we're closed to the public, but when we are open to the public, we enjoy having civilian visitors, but we also have a really large population of soldiers that visit us here at the Army Women's Museum. I hope you can come in the future. And I would just like to begin by thanking any active duty and veterans that we have in our virtual audience today. We really appreciate your service. So I'm going to share this program called From Here to Over There, where I'm going to talk specifically about two women who served in World War II. Most of everyone is familiar with the guy on the left, right? This is G.I. Joe, and he's our iconic soldier from World War II, and he's been covered in history books and the modern media alike. We know him as the foundation of the greatest generation, those Americans who served in the global war and came home with quiet dignity to lead the country forward. But the lesser known stories are those of the women who also served in the Army. And today I'm going to share this program in which we're going to follow the journey of two specific women as they served during World War II. And I've selected these two stories as representatives of the hundreds of thousands of women who answered the country's call. So one served in the Women's Army Corps, or WWII, and the other one in the Army Nurse Corps, or ANC. So this will be a nice precedent to the program in 2 weeks about the flight nurses. So let's begin, shall we? So my first story is that of Dorothy Mae Wise. And the reason I love her story is that it encompasses so many aspects of women's service during World War II. So Dorothy's story provides a wonderful snapshot of the diverse ways in which women contributed to the war effort, many of which required courage and dedication. So from her picture, you'll surely deduce that she was in the Women's Army Corps. But Dorothy's story starts a few years earlier in Canton, Ohio. Shortly after the attacks on Pearl Harbor, the War Production Board ordered a complete halt to the manufacture of non-essential consumer goods. The nation's industrial complex shifted to defense production, and a manpower shortage ensued. So you're probably familiar with the term Rosie the Riveter. That was the nickname given to the multitude of women who went to work in the factories as part of this conversion to war production. And a subset of these women were WOWs, or Women Ordnance Workers. And this is where Dorothy's story begins. So she was from Canton, Ohio, which was home to the Hoover Company, famous maker of vacuum cleaners. And it's estimated that 4 million Hoover vacuums were in American homes at the onset of the war. So with that War Production Board order, the last Hoover vacuum cleaner was assembled on April 30th, 1942 until the end of the war. And the company then began the conversion to manufacturing defense products. So their workforce grew dramatically. In 1941, Hoover had a workforce of 1,400 employees, 240 of whom were women. That was 17%. But by 1945, 4 years later, the workforce number grew to 5,600, 3,900, or almost 70% of whom were women. Eventually, the Hoover factory would produce M48 and M51 fuses, incendiary bomb parts, shot bags, life belt inflator mechanisms, parachutes, and propeller motors. So Dorothy was one of those WOWs who worked at the Hoover factory in the Ordnance Assembly Division. She also served as a factory representative to the Labor Management Committee of the War Production Drive. And luckily for us, the Hoover factory had their own newspaper called the Newsy News. And so they followed Dorothy's journey and many other journeys of people that worked in the factory and then went on to serve in the military. So Dorothy's actually pictured here in the bottom of the newspaper article that's dated May 1st, 1942. And this is important because this is the very same month that Colonel Oveta Culp Hobby would take the oath of office as the brand new director of the Women's Army Corps. So when the opportunity arose for women to join the Army, Dorothy quickly volunteered and was one of literally the very first women to join the Women's Army Corps. The Hoover factory was very proud of their employees who enlisted, as you can see from this article, celebrating those who entered Uncle Sam's service. And Dorothy there is pictured on the left. She was 21 years old and ready for an adventure when she left that Hoover company in October of 1942. So I'm going to show you now a short newsreel that captures the spirits of the WWIIs and the work that they were doing. And this is just a really nice snapshot of the Women's Army Corps. So let me see if I can get it to play for you.
On every front, the men of America are carrying on our fight for freedom. And back of them is another army, a woman's army. The Women's Army Corps, the WWIIs. Women from every walk of life, of every race, creed, and color. Women who have recognized their stake in the future of America. They carry no arms, and their work is far behind the fighting line. But for every WWII volunteer, another soldier is released for combat duty. Another weapon turned against the Axis.
So it's pretty inspirational, wouldn't you say? So Dorothy decided that sounded like a great opportunity. So she enlisted in the Women's Army Corps. She did her initial training at Fort Des Moines, Iowa, and then she went on to the 2nd WWII Training Center in Daytona Beach, Florida, to be trained as an Army cook. So here on the right is a Signal Corps photo featuring Dorothy. The caption on the back reads, WWIIs trained for service at Daytona Beach, Florida, to do many tasks now performed by Army officers and enlisted men, thus freeing them for field duty. Under the watchful eye of a mess sergeant, tens of oysters ready to be fried cover the table while cooks complete the task of dipping them. 1942. So the original intent of the WWII was that women would not be sent overseas. You could probably detect that from the short clip. But shortly after its creation, the Army realized that they needed these women to serve all over the world, and that restriction was lifted. And you probably guessed it, Dorothy was one of the very first women to be sent overseas. She became part of the 149th Headquarters Company, which was the first WWII company to be sent to North Africa during World War II. An envelope arrived for her parents from WWII director Aveda Kalpabi in January of 1943. And this picture is pictured here on the, or this letter is pictured on the left. A letter from Dorothy was enclosed along with a personal note from Colonel Hobby to Mr. and Mrs. Wise, which read, I feel that I am privileged to be the leader of a group of women who have volunteered for the sort of service for which she and her fellow members of the Corps are giving. I hope you, who are nearest to them, will let me share in the pride you feel. Well, the Newsy News was proud too, and they captured Dorothy's journey in the article entitled Hoover WWII Reaches Africa. The article noted that the detachment of which Auxiliary Wise was a member would serve as a part of the headquarters staff of Lieutenant General Dwight D. Eisenhower, commanding American forces in Northern Africa. So the danger involved in the transatlantic journey was also noted in the article, which pointed out that the WWIIs experienced several alerts at sea, and some depth charges were dropped when a destroyer was believed to have made contact with a submarine. And up in the corner, the cabin identification tag is from one of the trips that Dorothy took while she was stationed in North Africa. So while serving there, Dorothy met her husband, William Chandler, or Bill, who is pictured here on the left. They later married when they both returned home and were discharged from the Army. In the top right picture, Dorothy was doing a radio show in Algiers. And interestingly, on the photograph, she's written that Al Jolson was also one of the guests on this radio show. And then the picture below is of Dorothy and Bill in the kitchen with Dorothy's commanding officer. So we're really fortunate that Dorothy took all of these wonderful photographs while she was over there. So after 18 months in Africa, some WWIIs were moved to England to help prepare for the coming D-Day invasion. Others, including Dorothy, were sent on to Italy. So Dorothy was stationed in Naples and became the head cook of an Army hospital there. So this article on the left tells the charming story of Dorothy's brother, Ed, who was serving in the Merchant Marines during the war. His boat had docked in Toronto, Italy, and he immediately started to look for ways to get to Naples to see his sister. He found a transport plane headed that way, but the only seat he could find on the plane was in a Jeep that was tied down and ready for transport. So it was a fine seat indeed, and allowed Ed to visit his sister Dorothy for a much welcomed family reunion. The letter on the right is from the Theater WWII staff director, Major Dorothea Coleman, to Sergeant Dorothy Wise. And it reads, 2 years in ratio to a normal lifespan are small, but the 2 years you are now completing represent an unforgettable chapter in the world's history. As pioneer American women participating in an overseas assignment in World War II, you will be remembered not as individuals, but as members of an historic unit. All told, Dorothy was overseas for almost 2.5 years. Some of the highlights included visiting Egypt and riding on a camel to see the pyramids, and she also had brief stops in Athens and Malta. Her last assignment as a WAC was at Camp Atterbury, Indiana, where she was discharged as a Tech 4. For her service in the Women's Army Corps, Dorothy received a Good Conduct Medal, a European African Eastern Theater Ribbon, a Bronze Star, a WAC Service Ribbon, and 3 Overseas Service Bars. So Dorothy's story captures so many fascinating aspects of women's experiences in World War II that we made a short animated film that plays in our World War II gallery here at the Army Women's Museum. And we also have her uniform on display. So while her story may never be told in history books, Dorothy Wise was a pioneer and a patriot, and we're really honored to be able to tell her story here at the U.S. Army Women's Museum. So that's just the first story, and hopefully you'll have some questions for me at the end. And she's one of my favorites. And then our second story that I want to tell you about is another woman, an Army nurse named Lieutenant Beulah or Peggy Greenwald. The Army Nurse Corps, or ANC, was established in 1901. So Peggy joined the Army Nurse Corps at the age of 20 years old to see the world. She was one of fewer than 7,000 nurses on active duty when the United States entered World War II. As with Dorothy, Peggy found herself on the front line of American history as she became one of the famous Angels of Bataan. And these are the nurses who survived 33 months of imprisonment at the Santo Tomas internment camp. So in 1941, Peggy was a general duty nurse stationed at Sternberg General Hospital in the Philippines. And at the time, this was considered a choice assignment. Manila was beautiful, and the nurses felt they had easy shifts with plenty of time to play golf and tennis at the Army Navy Club in Manila. While there were rumblings of war that concerned military service members in the Philippines, they were not prepared for what was to come. So when Pearl Harbor was bombed on December 7th, the very next day, the Japanese began bombing the Philippines, and the ground invasion was soon to follow. So Peggy and her fellow nurses in the Philippines quickly found themselves practicing combat medicine in a war zone, a job for which most had not been trained. The nurses cared for the casualties and eased suffering as much as possible, even as they endured continued bombing raids. The Army quartermasters issued them standard olive drab coveralls that were much too large. They were men's coveralls to each nurse to replace their impractical long white dresses. By the end of December 1941, about 43,000 Japanese troops began the main invasion of Luzon. And so when Manila fell, the nurses were moved to field hospitals on the Bataan Peninsula and on the island of Corregidor. So here we have a picture of Sternberg Hospital from 1929, and then of course a newspaper article, this one from Davenport, Iowa, talking about the bombing of Pearl Harbor. So Peggy retreated with the American and Filipino troops to the Bataan Peninsula. She and her fellow nurses worked in what would come to be known as Jungle Hospital number 1 and number 2. The Army and Navy nurses worked in deplorable conditions, establishing the first open-air hospitals since the American Civil War. They had limited food rations and medical equipment, while they were also facing disease, exposure, and exhaustion. These hospitals were soon overwhelmed, and when the fragile hold on Bataan began to weaken, the Army set its sights on a last-ditch effort on the tiny island of Corregidor. So on April 9th, 1942, General Edward King surrendered Bataan and the infamous Death March began for 66,000 Filipinos and 10,000 American prisoners of war. Forced to make a 65-mile brutal march, hundreds of Americans and thousands of Filipinos died from starvation, thirst, and random execution throughout this ordeal. The very same day, Peggy was sent to the Melinda Tunnel complex on Corregidor with her fellow Army nurses. She had a camera with her, and she snapped some amazing photos of the journey. So the top two photos here were taken between 9 a.m. and noon on April 9th, the day of the surrender, while the nurses were on a ship in Manila Bay waiting for the all clear on Corregidor so they could go ashore. So Peggy's pictured in the right-hand photo wearing the helmet and smiling at the camera. Peggy made a note on this photograph to say, "We had been all night getting out of Bataan." So here she takes a picture once the boat has docked and the nurses are rushing into the tunnel complex. Later, General Wainwright spoke of the nurses that day saying, quote, "The memory of their coming ashore on Corregidor that early morning of April 9th, 1942, dirty, disheveled, some of them wounded, and every last one of them with her chin up is a memory that can never be erased." Once in the tunnel, the nurses set to work establishing hospital wards and putting their skills learned on Bataan to good use. They had become experts at dressing field wounds, administering anesthetics, and detecting dehydration and disease. The tunnel, however, brought new challenges as the dank air caused respiratory ailments and the close quarters led to fungal infections and skin boils. The tunnel inhabitants were also subjected to continuous bombardment during their month on the island. In the picture above, Peggy noted, after Bataan had surrendered, some enlisted men got out their musical instruments and asked Major Kerwanek of the quartermaster to get some of the nurses to come and dance. The major and I are pictured dancing. And also in this picture, let me just point out the triple bunks for the soldiers have been pushed off to the side there on the right, you can see. And you can see their makeshift little band with it looks like an organ and a trumpet. But in many ways, this picture is prophetic. So the Japanese landed on Corregidor a few weeks later, and on May 6th, General Wainwright surrendered. Prior to the Japanese evacuating everyone from the island, Major Frank Kerwanek, the officer that Peggy is pictured dancing with, handed First Lieutenant Greenwald the 12th Quartermaster regimental colors, and he asked her, if possible, to keep them safe. Later, Peggy said she knew the colors represented the soul of a regiment and that they would serve as a symbol of resistance. She quickly folded up the flag and packed it away. Once she was taken as prisoner of war, a Japanese soldier found the curious tan-colored blue fringed cloth, and Lieutenant Greenwald convinced her captors it was a shawl, and they let her keep it. They let her keep the flag. A week before the nurses and patients were taken off the island of Corregidor, the Japanese allowed the nurses to move to the hospital they had used in peacetime, topside above the tunnels. And the Japanese had built a barbed wire fence around the road that encircled the hospitals, and the nurses were allowed to walk in that area. So here is Peggy's description of the next few photos that she took. She said, "One day when everyone was inside out of the heat and the guards were sitting near the gate, I asked Bertha Henderson to go with me and watch for the guards so that I could finish my roll of film. I had some things in a paper bag which I removed from the bag, and I put my camera in it. And I was able to finish my roll of film, which I then removed from the camera. I put the film in my coveralls when we were taken to Santo Tomas." So here you have pictures of the hospital and her friend Bertha Henderson inside the hospital. And of course, you can see the destruction from all the bombardment. And here are a few more images of the enlisted men's barracks. And then, of course, on the right, the ruins of the nurses' quarters where they had lived prior. to hostilities breaking out. And then finally here, one last haunting photo of Corregidor. And Peggy had written that this is Corregidor with Melinda Hill, where the tunnels were in the distance. So Peggy and the nurses were moved from Corregidor to the Santo Tomas internment camp. Formerly, it was a Dominican academy known as Santo Tomas University, and this camp held what the Japanese called enemy nationals. So ultimately, it housed some 3,800 men, women, and children from the United States, Great Britain, Australia, Canada, Poland, Norway, France, and the Netherlands as prisoners. And even though they lived on a very limited diet, on average, the nurses lost 30 pounds each. And they were denied all comforts. The American Army and Navy nurses persevered. They worked 4-hour shifts every day and continued to care for the other soldiers and the civilians in the camps. And all the while, Lieutenant Greenwald prevented the quartermaster colors from being captured. And finally, in January of 1945, Santo Tomas was liberated when Allied forces retook the Philippine Islands. And all 77 women, the largest group of POWs in US history, and all of the other POWs were liberated. So in the meantime, Major Koronic was enduring plenty of hardships as well. The Major had been born in Austria, and he immigrated to the United States in 1906, and he had served with the Army at the Mexican border in 1916, and then overseas with the Army Expeditionary Forces in World War I. So now Major Koronic had survived the battles of Bataan and Corregidor, 2 prison ship sinkings, and 3.5 years as a prisoner of war. He later noted that while he and other prisoners were slowly starving and dying of disease, Peggy and the other nurses at Santo Tomas were smuggling in money and medicine to keep them alive. Amazingly, they were both from the St. Louis area, and after they were released and returned to the United States, Major Koronic and Nurse Greenwald reunited in St. Louis. And that flag that both of them had risked all to keep safe was presented back to Frank Koronic at a meeting of the American Legion in St. Louis in October of 1945. Nurse Greenwald had to keep her promise. In 1961, after his death, Koronic's wife donated the colors of the 12th Quartermaster Regiment to the Quartermaster Museum right here at Fort Lee. And this artifact is currently located here at the Army Women's Museum. So after the war, years later, Peggy married, well, right after the war, she married another prisoner of war. And then years later, she participated in a Department of Defense documentary entitled We All Came Home, Army and Navy Nurse POWs in World War II. So I'd like to share just a snippet with you. There's a little break in between, so there's kind of 2 parts to this. And later, if you'd like to watch the whole documentary, it is available on YouTube. But I think Peggy's story coming from her own, from herself is really powerful. So let me play this for you.
In the Melinda Tunnel Hospital, when Corregidor was surrendered, we did not see the flag being lowered.
The Quartermaster Major Frank Koronic came to my ward about an hour before the surrender, and he had the quartermaster flag with him. He said, "Peggy, will you try to hold on to this flag and get it back to the States if you can?" And I said that I would. And when we got to Santo Tomas internment camp, the Japanese put us in one large room and searched all of our belongings. When there were 2 of them searching the footlocker that I had the flag in, and when they saw the flag, they said, or they motioned, what's this? You know, they weren't speaking English, but they were pointing to the flag and wanting to know what it was. And I pretended that it was a shawl. I just gestured that it was a shawl. And so they still looked concerned and talked between them and still weren't certain that that's what it was, I guess. But I just gestured again that it was a shawl, put around my shoulders, and they let me keep it.
So in conclusion, Peggy's story, like that of Dorothy, may not be well known as an individual story, but it's certainly remarkable in its own way. And we here at the Army Women's Museum are honored to be charged with preserving and sharing these stories. So in conclusion, I would also just like to thank the D-Day Memorial for this opportunity to present as a part of Women's History Month 2021. And if you're interested in more of these types of stories about women's service in World War II, you're certainly welcome to join us on our website. We do have a virtual tour, so even though we're not open to the public right now, you can come to our website and get a really awesome tour virtually. And then we also do programming like this, so you're welcome to book a specific program, which is also, there's information on our website. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now, and hopefully you all have some questions.
Perfect. Tracy, that was fantastic. I mean, my goodness, there's nothing I think more powerful than actually hearing those individual stories. I love the videos. The video of Peggy speaking about her experience was very, very powerful. Did she write much about her experiences? Do you have, I know she was involved in the documentary you mentioned, but did she write about her experiences as well?
So no, I don't. We don't have any of her writings per se, but she has been included in several books. So if you're interested in the story of these women, generally Peggy's story is included. And she was the basis of a part of the movie entitled They Were Expendable. So her story is also told there, but it's a very fictionalized account, and she was extremely unhappy with it after the movie was made. I think it was very Hollywood.
Yes.
And I think some, romance or whatever.
I don't know if she's in this particular book, We Band of Angels. I think
she is. I have it right here. So the story of the flag, she's included. It's very short, but it definitely captures that history. So
very good. Yes, that's a powerful story. The image of the flag being taken down, and it had to be a moment for them to realize and to be in the situation as prisoners of war as long as they were. It's just an amazing story. But also Dorothy, I love hearing that kind of transition of her from, being in the, a WOW basically to a WAC, and how she made that transition and her service as well. So are those particular artifacts, the things that you have there, are they on display currently? I know you can't go physically in the museum right now, but will they be?
Right. So Dorothy's uniform is on display currently. And then we have this, the cartoon video or cartoon movie that we had made. So that's on display. The flag is not currently on display, but we hope to get that out soon. So, because it's on loan to us from the Quartermaster Museum.
And we did have a couple of questions as well. Tracy, one that came in was that WACs were non-combatants, but could be in very dangerous situations, obviously. So did they receive firearms training?
No, in fact, women in the Army would not receive firearms training until the 1970s.
Wow, that's amazing.
They were absolutely yes. And I think it's interesting considering that so many changes have occurred since 9/11, especially in the last few years with the Army rescinding the combat exclusion policy. Yet when you hear these stories, you realize, especially with those nurses, they were absolutely in a combat situation. There's no question about that.
Wow, that's very interesting. And we had a couple of other comments. One who said that just very appreciative of you sharing these stories, that their aunt was a nurse who landed in France on D-Day. Is there a way to research information about her service? So actually, I'll share a little bit, but yes, please talk a little bit about that, Tracy. How do you go about researching some of these incredible women?
Right. Okay, that's a great question. So if you go onto our website, there's a way that you can email us through the website. And if there's a form that we'll have you fill out to get all the information that we can. We do have a sizable amount of Army nurse information here, but we also have an AMED, an Army Medical Museum down in Texas, where they have even more. So we can certainly try to find the people that would have the information about your family member.
That's fantastic. We have resources also. I encourage you to certainly reach out to us. Also at dday.org, and we can kind of get you on a path. That's fascinating. We're going to be talking about nurses in D-Day on March 18th, when we talk about flight nurses, and many who actually came into the beaches several days after the invasion and what they did. So hope our guests will tune into that as well. I'm not seeing, let's see if we have any other questions here. Again, Tracy, what a wonderful program. I can't wait until the Army Museum opens again. You really have to come out and see your latest exhibits and everything. I know you're anxiously awaiting that as well.
Oh, we are, yes. We miss you all.
We as well. We really, and it's so great to be able to collaborate like this, because I think these are such important stories, and it's so wonderful to be able to share these stories, what these women did. Oftentimes, we just don't know about them, and it's such a critical part of our history. So thank you for sharing their stories, and there's so many more like that. Can you give us just very quickly a short history of the museum, when you opened, and the other types of exhibits that you have?
Oh, sure, absolutely. So actually, this museum began as the Women's Army Corps Museum back in 1955 at Fort McClellan, Alabama. And it was those first WWII veterans who literally sold cookies and bricks to build their own museum to capture their history. So the WWII Training Center was down at Fort McClellan for many, many years, and that's where the museum stayed. When there was a base realignment and closure, the Army needed to find a new home for the museum, and they chose Fort Lee because we also have a historical connection. After World War II, we were the first permanent training center of the Women's Army Corps. So every single woman that joined the Army between 1948 and 1954 came here through Fort Lee. But the Army also recognized that the WWII story was really just one piece of a much larger story. So with the move came a new name, the U.S. Army Women's Museum, and a new mission to cover Army women's history from 1775 to the present. And then what's exciting here is that 2 years ago, we underwent an expansion and a complete renovation. So now everything is brand new in our galleries. We tell, I think, a beautifully balanced story, and the Army definitely is recognizing the importance of women's service and the monumental changes that have been taking place in the very recent past, and they continue to change today. So it's a real honor to be able to tell these stories.
That's great. Thank you. And we did have someone actually ask, and you had mentioned you're in your virtual studio there where you do a lot of programming. And the individual, I think, just wanted to know what kind of items are behind you on display there.
Okay, so let's see. I've got a lot of stuff back here, but the program that we were doing for February was called An Island of Integration, and it was all about the desegregation of the Army, a lot of which happened right here at Fort Lee during those after-war years. And so we have artifacts here from that time period of when the Army was being desegregated racially. So we've got a steel pot helmet and a WWII uniform and some other items that we share when we tell those stories.
That's wonderful.
So if you're interested, yeah, you can go through our website, but we also have our programming on CILC. That's another way to get to if you would like to book a virtual program. And we do K through 12, but we're also happy to talk to community groups or adult learners as well. So we have several different programs that we offer.
That's perfect. Great resource. So happy to be able to have you today, Tracy. And again, we thank you. And
well, thank you.
Yes, and we look forward to doing this again. I think we're going to have to hear more stories because I want to hear more.
Yay, so, that means I get to go back in the archives. Thank you.
Yes, absolutely. So again, we thank you so much. I encourage everyone certainly to use the U.S. Army Museum as a resource because their stories are fantastic. And again, hopefully everything will be up and running soon, but these virtual types of programs are great to getting out to a broad audience. And we thank you for sharing Dorothy and Peggy's story with us today. So many people can hear that. So again, thank you, Tracy.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Thank you all for joining us today. And we look forward to seeing you all at our next lecture. And Tracy, we'll be in touch.
Okay, and stay safe, everyone. Bye.
Bye-bye.